Okay, that's good. Well, I'm going to talk to you guys about the Apollo missions. Now, that John was saying quite correctly there that that's really where my interest in astronomy and space started. I was privileged to be 7 years old at the time that Apollo 8 happened. Apollo 8, of course, happened over Christmas in 1968, and at the same time, on Christmas Day, my parents gave me Patrick Moore's Observer's Book of Astronomy. So I can pin down to one particular day when my interest in space and astronomy began, and it was Christmas Day 1968, a long time ago. But actually, I remember a lot of it as if it was almost yesterday. But I'm going to start this story. This started out, by the way, you're privileged, you guys, because I first put this together as a talk about Apollo 8 on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8 in 2018 for the IAA, and then it went up to Apollo 11, and then I did a second talk that sort of did Apollos 12 and the rest onwards. And actually, this is the first time that I've collapsed the whole thing into one long story. So you're privileged to be the first people to see this. So I'll start the story as I always do. Back at World War II, the end of World War II, it was an interesting time, rocket-wise, interesting time other ways, but work had been done with rockets before this. But this was really the first time a functional rocket was built and used actually to drop bombs on London. And Werner von Braun built the V2, launched from Peenemünde on the Baltic coast of Germany. And funny enough, my father, who is 91 years old, was probably one of the last people alive who ever saw a V2 rocket explode, because he lived in London at the time, and he saw one explode over London in 1944, and you can actually, via the internet, pin down what that was and whereabouts it was. It was over Ilford in East London. So that was Werner von Braun and his engineers. They ended up surrendering to the Allied, mostly American forces at the end of World War II. The received wisdom was that was better than being captured by the Russians. However, the Russians, of course, did get many of the factories. So both sides, the Americans and the Russians, both Allied sides, they got the stuff and the know-how and the technique and the people, and they both continued the work of Werner von Braun.
Recording in progress.
Developing the V2 rocket. The Soviets built a thing called the R1 in 1947. The Americans developed it a bit further, and by 1950 they had a rocket called Bumper, which was a V2 with a second stage on it, so it could go even higher. They sort of worked away on that and started, getting towards the edge of space with their rockets. The Soviets worked at it further, and they built this amazing thing here. You can see the picture called the R1. And the R1, if you look at that is so like a modern Soyuz. That was pretty much the design they came up with. So that's the R7, this one. The original V2 version was the R1. This has 5 engines, each with 4 nozzles. So you've got a 20 nozzle rocket. It wasn't designed to go to space. It was designed. It was the first intercontinental ballistic missile. That is to say, it was designed to drop atomic bombs on Europe and America should the need arise. Fortunately, at least not yet. That hasn't happened. But what they did, they had this idea that they would use it to go to space, and on the 4th of October 1957, they launched Sputnik 1 into orbit. Sputnik just sort of means satellite. Actually, it wasn't an amazingly imaginative name. And of course, the Americans were terrified, because if the Russians can put Sputnik up into orbit, then they could put cameras and bombs and all sorts there. So the Americans had to respond. And what they did was they pulled together all the people who were working on different strands of rocketry and so on, and formed NASA on the 29th of July 1958. And they also then went about getting together some astronauts, because they thought they were going to put men into space fairly soon. So they recruited the Mercury 7 astronauts. And the mission there was to place human-rated spacecraft in Earth orbit, observe the astronaut's performance in such conditions, and return him safely to the Earth. So that was the Mercury thing. Now then, the Russians, of course, made another advance, and they put the first Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, into space on the 12th of April 1961. Now, because this is the Soviet Union in 1961, at the height of the Cold War we're talking about, information was a bit unreliable or maybe not too freely flowing, and there was a lot of conjecture, and the conspiracy theorists love this one, that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man they put into space, he was merely the first one they got back. And there were, to support this, pictures surreptitiously obtained of a dead body being taken out of a Soyuz capsule. And it turns out now, we find out that this was actually a cosmonaut called Igor Ivanovich, who was not an astronaut really as such. He was a crash test dummy, and they put a body full of sensors up into space. First, it seems an entirely sensible thing to do. So we think now probably that Yuri Gagarin was indeed the first man in space. Now, obviously the Americans, again, needed to respond to this. They had the feeling of falling behind. And so the new young president, John F. Kennedy, commissioned Lyndon B. Johnson, his deputy, to find something that the Americans could do where they could beat the Russians. And this is what happened next.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So there you go. So how's that for a challenge? You've got a well-defined objective there to send a man to the moon, bring him safely back to the Earth, and to do it within the decade. So that's the challenge that JFK set NASA, and that's where he was getting the money to do it. So the first thing they did, Project Mercury, 6 rocket launches, all single manned capsules between 1961 and 63. The first 2 were launched on a Mercury Redstone rocket. That was a military rocket, quite small, and that was not powerful enough to put them right into orbit, but they did 2 15-minute suborbital flights, similar to the sort of thing actually that Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos are doing now with their crewed flights. And 2 of those, Alan B. Shepard was the first up on 5th of May 1961. Gus Grissom on the 21st of July. He went up. Then, the big one, they put the Mercury capsule on a much bigger rocket, the Atlas, and that was powerful enough to put it right into orbit. John Glenn went up on the 20th of February 1962, and he did over 2 complete orbits. He became the first American in orbit. There were 3 more Mercury missions, the last of which was Gordo Cooper in 1963. There's a couple of my holiday snaps from the Kennedy Space Center. This here is a Mercury Redstone. That's the Mercury capsule on top with its escape rocket, whose job was to pull it clear in the event of anything disastrous happening down here. And this is the Redstone rocket. See, quite small compared to this one, that's the Atlas rocket, which was powerful enough to get them right into orbit, and the Mercury capsule on top of there. So that's the 2 varieties of Mercury. The next step they did, Project Gemini. And I say Gemini deliberately. They actually put out a press release to say it's Gemini, not Gemini. But this was the next step. What they wanted to do, having mastered the art of going up and coming down, which is really all Mercury did, they had got more astronauts now. They had, as well as the Mercury 7, they had the new 9 and the class of 1963. And they built a 2-man capsule. This is the capsule part of it, and this is the supporting rocket behind it. And this was lifted by a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile booster. again using a military rocket for convenience. The objective really, they wanted to do manoeuvring, rendezvous and docking in space. They also wanted to do a test of endurance, and one of the missions was 14 days long, to get the idea of that's how long you have to be in space to go to the moon and back. So that's what they did. They did all of that in 12 missions, of which 10 were manned during Project Gemini. And they also did the first spacewalk. Ed White did the first American spacewalk. I'll stress American because Alexei Leonov did it 3 months previously as a cosmonaut. So the Russians were ahead again on that one. But they were getting towards the moon now. But so they planned Project Apollo, and these were the choices really for the mission profiles for going to the moon. They could either do direct ascent, and that's where you launch a rocket from Earth, go to the moon, land it on the moon, take off the same rocket from the moon and come back. And that would have required a Saturn C8, a thing that only really existed on the drawing board, but that was like a Saturn V, only instead of 5 engines, it had 8 engines of the same size on the back of it, a much bigger rocket. And there were all sorts of complications with that, not the least of which was landing that on the moon and getting it off again. Earth Orbit Rendezvous, which was to do the same sort of thing, except rather than launch this enormous rocket from Earth in one go, they would build it in Earth orbit from several missions to actually put the bits together there, and that would make it a bit easier. But there's a lot of complication in having lots of missions there. And the winner, the third option, the one they actually chose to do, was Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. That's where you bring along a small spacecraft with your big spacecraft, and then you just use that to go down to the moon and come back, and then you dock onto your bigger rocket and come home in that. And this is the mission profile here. It sort of takes off from Florida there, heads on up, goes into Earth orbit. Then there's a bit called translunar injection there where it leaves Earth orbit, and then there's a bit of manoeuvring and docking goes on here as we take out the smaller spacecraft from its cubby hole behind the main capsule. Then that all goes to the moon. The smaller spacecraft, what became known as the LEM, or the Lunar Excursion Module, or often just the Lunar Module, that goes down to the moon, and then a couple of days later it takes off from the moon, comes back, docks with the Apollo and comes back to Earth, and then they just undock the capsule, which is the only bit that comes home, and splash that down in the Pacific here. So that's what they did. Now then, they started off with a tragedy. Apollo 1 was to be a test flight in January 1967, and they were testing it on the pad, Launch Complex 34, and unfortunately a fire started inside the capsule, and they were all killed. 3 astronauts in that capsule were killed because there was nothing they could do about it. Certain things they learned a lot of lessons from that accident, so they didn't die necessarily in vain. Spacecraft was redesigned. They called it Block 2. This was Block 1, I'm afraid, here. They changed a lot of things. The quality of the wiring and stuff was poor. They used a pure oxygen atmosphere, so the problem there was that anything that caught fire, which it did, it burns 5 times better or worse, more ferociously in pure oxygen than it does in air. So they stopped using pure oxygen at full pressure. That wasn't a good idea. Also, the door opened inwards on the original Block 1, and that meant that when the fire started, the pressure sealed the door shut. So what they did later, they actually made the outward opening door so that the astronauts could get out if there was a fire. That was the theory. It never happened again, so we don't know that it was possible to get out, but that was a common sense thing. So the Saturn V rocket. Here's a Saturn V on the ground. This it's not like that anymore. I took that photo in 1995 at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where They tell you that it's Apollo 18. It's not quite Apollo 18 because it's a bit of a mishmash of parts. But that still exists exactly where it is now, except that they've built a hangar around the outside of it to protect it for future generations. But here's the design started in 1961, first flew 9th of November 1967. We'll see that flight in a moment. They built 15, flew 13. There's one of number 14 and number 15 at the Kennedy Space Center. Weighs 6.5 million pounds, and the thrust is 7.5 million pounds. So that's how it takes off. 3 stages. First stage uses 3,000 gallons of fuel per second. It burns RP1 and liquid oxygen. RP1 is basically aviation fuel, slightly more pure and better, but that's what it is. Stage 2 does liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen as the third stage. It's to do, the use of RP1 rather than liquid hydrogen is to do with balance, and it keeps the centre of gravity low when it's on the pad. So, let's have a look at the first Saturn V launch. Now, the 2 things about this. One is the sheer shock, because they've never seen anything like this before. The reporters reporting on it just say, this is amazing. But also, unlike all subsequent big rocket launches, they didn't think to dump loads of water on the launch pad. And that gave them huge problems with noise and vibration. It's not even so much heat, although you see loads of steam in modern launches. This was just, loads of smoke and fantastic vibration. And the reporters just were so awestruck by the whole thing. The other thing is there's a mistake in the footage, actually, that they where they show you the rocket in a hangar. It's a Saturn 1B, not a Saturn V. So just be aware of that.
Good morning. Behind me is the largest single object man has ever attempted to lift off the face of the Earth. Its official designation is Saturn V. It stands as tall as a 36-story building, and though it is unmanned for this flight, this is the monster rocket with which America ultimately will place men on the moon.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 5, 4, we have ignition.
All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The tower has...
My God, our building's shaking here. Our building's shaking. Oh, it's terrific. The building's shaking. This big glass window is shaking. We're holding it with our hands. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet. The roar is terrific. Look at it going. You can see it. You can see it. Part of our roof is coming here.
We don't know if you can hear, ladies and gentlemen, but all the flight is moving along as it should be. But our observation booth here, the NBC observation booth, is literally being shaken apart. Our tape recorders are being thrown to the floor by the roar of this mighty rocket as it continues to climb into the sky on its 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It is a beautiful sight, an unbelievable sight.
Frank, there's just never been anything like it. The Titan II that powered Gemini, the Mercury Atlas that powered John Glenn on our early orbital flights, they looked impressive at the time. But not until you felt your flesh vibrate and your desk lift and your body thunder with the vibration from that rocket going could you sense the excitement. It's just bigger, and it worked better the first time than anything we've ever used. The spacecraft is now well into its first revolution around the Earth, and a historic flight well underway. Frank?
Thank you very much, Jules. I know you've had a very pleasant morning. Well, Apollo 4 is on the way, and the mission apparently seems to be going well. I think for NASA and for America's space program, you can say, oh, what a beautiful morning this has been. This is Frank Reynolds in New York.
There you go. So that's the all-up test. That's what they did. They just built the whole rocket. They didn't test one piece at a time. They built the whole thing and built a mission that tested out the entire Apollo, and it worked absolutely superbly the first time. Now, they did follow, before they did Apollo 8, they did follow a couple of other test missions. Apollo 5 was an unmanned flight with the lunar module on a Saturn 1B. There was a second Saturn 5 test launch, Apollo 6, which didn't go quite as well as Apollo 4. And this is a bit of an insight into the way thinking worked in the 60s that it doesn't work now. Although there were problems with Apollo 6, and actually had they had astronauts on it, they would probably have been killed, shaken to death. They sort of said, well, we know why this is and we can fix it. So the next Saturn V that launched, Apollo 8, they just put 3 men on top of it, just like that. They wouldn't do that now. There would be another few years of development, I should think, but they had a looming deadline, so they went for it. There was Apollo 7 in October 1968, which was a test of the capsule in low Earth orbit, again on the Saturn 1B rocket. But the big gamble really was Apollo 8, with the deadline looming and evidence that the Russians weren't far away from catching up. They changed the Apollo launch schedule to include, they didn't have a lunar module, but they did have a moon-capable rocket. So they said, well, let's go to the moon and just go around it 10 times and come back. That's what they did. Apollo 8 became the first mission to the moon. No lunar module, they just went there, tested the whole Saturn V with 3 men on it, went into lunar orbit, did 10 orbits over Christmas 1968, which is where I came in a 6-day mission, and that's what they did. Worked extremely well. The crew, Borman, Lovell and Anders, launched on December 21st, 1968, went into orbit on Christmas Eve, 1968, did those 10 orbits, including the Christmas greetings of the reading of the book of Genesis over Christmas, then returned to Earth, a splashdown in the Pacific in darkness on the 27th. And there's the crew, Frank Borman, Bill Anders and Jim Lovell, and that's that. Now, I'm just going to do a little aside here just to talk about the computer technology, because rockets haven't really advanced all that much since. I mean, they've got a bit better, a bit more efficient and so on, but really modern rockets aren't very different from 1968 rockets. But computers are a world away. And this is mission control here. It's not really bent like that. This is just my panoramic stitched photo of, because it's big. And all of these screens had information on, different bits of information, textual and primitive graphics, all monochrome as well, no colours. And that was all wired back to this computer system here. Now that was the mainframe, an IBM 360 mainframe computer. And that had a megabyte of RAM, which was absolutely huge in 1968. And it had a 4 megabyte hard drive that was delivered by a forklift truck as well. And then it had a lot of offline tape storage, because that's not enough to do the job on its own. But if you think about that, your phone is infinitely more powerful than mission control there. In fact, your watch probably give it a good run for its money now. It's just amazing how the technology has come on. The computer in the Apollo craft, the main one was the Apollo guidance computer. There was also another computer actually down inside the rocket that drove all the rockets and so on. But this was the one in the capsule. It consisted of the main system unit, which was buried away there, and the disky, as it's called, the display and keyboard, and that was the bit they had mounted in the cabin, and they input information into it through the keypad, and it displayed on a sort of panel here. And that had 4 kilobytes of magnetic core RAM in it and 72 kilobytes of rope core memory, ROM. So that's unchangeable, and that's what this looks like here. Ran at a clock speed of 2 megahertz. Well, I'm talking to you on a computer at the minute that runs at 4 gigahertz, so 2,000 times faster. But it was actually quite, for the time, that was quite an amazing piece of technology. Coding was done by hand in those days, and this was a lady. It wasn't an entirely male project. Apollo. Margaret Hamilton was the head of software engineering at NASA at the time, and this is all the programs that she wrote to actually guide men to the moon. And if you've seen the film Hidden Figures, you realise that really by this time computers were just coming in, and they had previously all the navigation and everything was worked out manually. Quite extraordinary. So there we go. So this is mission control. As it was, this is an actual 1968 or 9 photograph. My photograph that you just saw was the reconstructed version as it is at the Johnson Space Center in Texas now. But you can see all the things going on here. The guy in charge, I think this is probably him up here, is the flight director. And all of these people are monitoring some function of the spacecraft, and he is in charge. There is only one guy, and I think he sits down there. He's this guy here, is the capsule communicator, and he is an astronaut. Capsule communicator, Capcom. He is an astronaut, and he is the eyes and ears of the astronauts in mission control, and he is the only person in mission control who talks directly to the astronauts. So all communication with the spacecraft is routed through him. Otherwise, you would end up with complete babble with 20 people trying to talk to 3, and that wouldn't work. So, and here is a little clip of that happening, and this, I think, is absolutely just as historic as the one small step bit, because the capsule communicator at this point gives the instruction to Apollo 8 to leave Earth orbit. That's the first time that humans have ever left Earth orbit. And the instruction is you are go for TLI, that's translunar injection. This is a clip from the Earth to the Moon by HBO. So have a look at this.
Fido, flight.
Go, Flight.
Are you happy with the maneuver?
Yes, Flight, we're getting just what we wanted to see.
All flight controllers, I want go, no-go for a translunar injection burn. Retro?
Go, Flight.
Control?
Go.
Guidance?
We're go.
Inco?
Go, Flight.
Ecom?
We're Go, Flight.
GNC?
Go, Flight.
FAO?
We're Go, Flight.
Network?
Network, go.
Surgeon?
Go, Flight.
Capcom, we are go for translunar injection.
Apollo 8 Houston, you are go for TLI. You are go for the moon.
Roger, Houston. Apollo 8 is go.
And as a matter of fact, the Capcom who gave that instruction, Apollo 8, you will go for TLI, was Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot on Apollo 11, i.e. the one who didn't go down to the moon and had to come back on his own if they didn't make it. So, that was a little bit later on. So, that was it. The Apollo 8 achieved all that. It was launched from Launch Complex 39A and was the first manned use of that facility, the first humans to journey to the moon, the first pictures of Earth from deep space taken by astronauts, a new world speed record of 24,200 miles per hour, and the first live TV coverage of the lunar surface. They didn't go down to it, obviously, they merely saw it out the window, but we'll see a bit more of Apollo 8 a bit later. The next Apollo was Apollo 9. It was a test mission, and I think I've always thought of Apollo 9 as what a shocking waste of a Saturn V, because it only went into low Earth orbit. It didn't go to the moon, even though it was capable of doing so. But what they did with Apollo 9 was they did lots of docking tests and stuff that they hadn't done with Apollo 8 because there was no lunar module on Apollo 8. This they had the lunar module, they undocked it, they actually separated the two craft by over 100 miles, which was a very high-risk thing to do because there were 2 astronauts in the lunar module at this point. And the lunar module has no chance whatsoever of landing on Earth. Its little engine is no match for Earth's gravity. It's designed to land on the moon with 1/6 gravity, and it has no heat shield or anything like that. So that having got those 2 craft apart, they absolutely had to get them back together for the astronauts to come home. So that was Apollo 9, which all worked very well. Lots of tests done. If you were a test pilot, that was your mission. That was the one you wanted to be on. There's some pictures of the 2 craft separated in space, and that's it. And it all worked extremely well. Now, they then did Apollo 10, and Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal of the moon landing. It did everything except for the fact that that the lunar module only went down within 8 miles of the moon's surface and didn't go the rest of the way. So this is it. And of course, they when they separated the 2 craft, they had to give them separate names because Apollo 10 at that point was a confusing name, so they called the Command and Service Module Charlie Brown and the Lunar Module Snoopy. They got a bit more serious about those names a bit later on because they started getting a bit silly. So we've seen it with Boaty McBoatface and stuff here, haven't we? But this was Tom Stafford, John Young and Gene Cernan. Now, John Young stayed in the capsule, the command module thing, and Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford, they went down to the moon and they nearly lost the mission. In fact, they got back from it and they reckoned it was okay. But
when we'd made 2 passes over the lunar surface on Apollo 10 with the lunar module, separated from our command module several, tens or hundreds of miles away, on a second pass, we then simulated what would have to be done on the surface, where you separate the 2 stages, fire the ascent engine, and we're on our way to a rendezvous. And we did that with the abort guidance system rather than the primary guidance system, just to check out everything. We also checked out the landing radar on that mission and found out that it had been programmed improperly, and had that happened on Apollo 11, they would not have landed. So we found out some interesting things on Apollo 10.
The landing rehearsal was nearly complete. All that remained was to separate from the descent stage of the LEM and fly back to the command module. Stafford began resetting the controls, unaware that Cernan had done exactly the same thing.
And I had all the switches set, and Tom instinctively, as we will do, will reach over there and change the position of the guidance switch, because he knew it had to be changed to AGS. Well, I had already changed it to AGS. And so when it fired, it was on a primary guidance system, and the primary guidance system didn't know where to tell it to go. So we did separate, we spun out of control. I remember seeing a lunar horizon go by in different directions about 8 times in some 15 seconds. Tom took it back from the computer, got it under control. We gave it back to the abort guidance system. We got the burn on time when we rendezvoused, and everything turned out all right.
It was later determined that the lander had come within 2 seconds of crashing into the lunar surface before Stafford and Cernan regained control. Despite the few unnerving seconds, Apollo 10 had cleared a pathway almost down to the lunar surface. Snoopy's mission was over. The next LEM to fly was reserved for Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. It would be called the Eagle.
So that's really quite terrifying, isn't it? When you hear an account from the actual pilot of what happened there. They did come very close to losing that mission, but they decided that Apollo 11 was go, and they got the crew, Neil Armstrong, the commander, Michael Collins, command module pilot, and Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, and they launched on the 16th of July 1969, and the landing, it came back on the 24th. Of course, on the 20th, United States time, or early in the morning of the 21st of July, I was actually, woken and saw the first man walk on the moon. First of all, Armstrong went out Then 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin went out onto the moon. So the call signs, they had a 3 call sign mission here. Actually, it was the command module was Columbia, the lunar module was Eagle, but while it was on the moon, they called it Tranquility Base. And that's there. So this is the chronology of it. Launched on the 16th of July. 2 hours 33 minutes later, the translunar injection burn that we saw for Apollo 8 there earlier. Then the lunar orbit insertion at 75 hours 50 minutes, that is to say, 3 days and a bit into the mission. The lunar orbit insertion burn. Then they made that circular a few hours later, and they got it into a 2-hour lunar orbit. Then they, at 100 hours, that's 4 days into the mission, they undocked the lunar module. Then they fired the descent engine to slow down the orbit of the lunar module so it would actually start to descend to the moon's surface, and then they fired the descent engine until touchdown, because there's no air and no wings or anything like that. The only thing that keeps the lunar module from crashing is its rocket. Once they landed, they immediately prepared to lift off, because that's a safety thing. As soon as you get there, you might need to go in an emergency, in a hurry. So they prepared for that, and they did have a scheduled sleep period at that point. But obviously, when you've just got to the moon, you want to go out and look around, don't you? So that's they at their request they stopped that. Now then, here's just the configurations. Here's the 2 craft docked. That's the separation of the lunar module, and then the orientation of the lunar module to go down to the surface. Now we have. This is a very rare piece of footage I managed to find. This is Neil Armstrong himself talking us through the whole thing, the actual 12-minute descent to the moon. He talks about the last 3 minutes of it here.
This slide shows the trajectory to the surface. The actual powered descent of the lunar module to the surface took 12 minutes and 32 seconds. And this is just the final 3 minutes, the part that's really interesting as you get close to the surface of the moon. Now, in the left screen, you will see the original 1969 movie film that we took from the window of the lunar module Eagle. And on the right side, you will see what the crew saw looking out the window in front of them. Now, there is a shaded area there that shows you the exact duplicate of the area that's on the left, so you can compare the craters and see if they are duplicate of each other. The one on the left took place 42 years ago. This pictures on the right took place in the last 2 years. Okay, we've been descending. I should tell you, you'll hear the crewman talking. You'll hear my co-pilot giving altitude and descent rates, and you'll hear people in the background talking from mission control on Earth. We've been descending about 2,000 meters a minute. We're now down to about below 1,000 meters in altitude. My computer tells me that it's taking us to a landing just on the right side of that big crater up in the left-hand corner. The slopes are steep and the rocks look very large, the size of automobiles. Certainly not a place that I want to land. So I took over manually from the computer, the autopilot, and flew it like a helicopter on out to the west to try to find a smoother, more level landing spot. The computer is complaining now and then. You'll hear caution alarms, 1202s and 1201s, which is telling us the computer is a little bit concerned about its operation, but everything looks good, and the people in mission control tell us we can continue. Okay, we're about 100 meters above the soil, looking down at this 30-meter crater, about 8 meters deep. Looks like a real geological treasure. I want to go back there and look at that if I ever get the chance while I'm on foot. We're looking for a smooth spot beyond that crater. I see a smooth spot right up near the top of the screen. It looks like that's a good place to be, and I'm running low on fuel. I have less than 2 minutes of fuel.
Good. 20 feet.
Getting down below about 70 meters now.
9 forward.
50 meters, still looking good. In the left side, you will see in the old movie that the rocket engine is starting to kick up some dust off the surface.
Lights on. Down 2.5.
Get a 30-second fuel warning. Need to get it down on the ground here pretty soon before we run out. Okay. The picture on the left is more accurate, but there's more dust. There you see the shadow of my landing leg coming on the surface on the blowing dust. We're very close to the surface right now.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here.
So there you go. About 15 seconds of fuel left there, so no pressure. He just seems so totally calm about it, even on the original footage. But, so they're actually on the Sea of Tranquility. They landed on the moon July 20th, 1969, 2017. That's Universal Time. And the first step was at 2:56 in the morning. And I do remember it very well, 21st of July 1969. They did total EVA duration of 2 hours 31 minutes, and just a little note there, because it's compulsory that all Americans have Irish blood, and Neil Armstrong was no exception, that his ancestors included cattle rustlers from County Fermanagh. There you go. So he went out and put the television camera out first, and stepped onto the moon, and the first thing he did was he got a contingency rock sample, just in case they had to leave quickly. Aldrin followed 19 minutes later.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So there you are, that's as it happened. So they did some science, as well as actually going there and coming back. They put a solar wind composition experiment there and collected a larger sample of lunar rock. They deployed the laser ranging retro reflector, which is sort of a mirror. I think that would be doing it a disservice to say it's a mirror, but that's roughly what it is. And the idea there is that actually each of the Apollos put one of those there, and by shining lasers off them from Earth, we can get a very precise determination of the distance of the moon. And in fact, since that was put there just over 50 years ago, the moon has moved away from the Earth by over a metre, which is quite amazing. The moon is moving further away, and it is over a metre further away than it was on average there. They put the passive seismic experiment package, so that's looking for moonquakes, and a collection of 2 core tube samples. So they actually dug down a little bit to get more soil, not just the topsoil. They went to the lunar module and returned. They came back to the command and service module and came back to splash down in the Pacific Ocean on the 24th of July. And that was the Apollo 11 mission. Now then, Apollo 12, they started now doing a sequence of bigger and better moon landing missions. And this one, Apollo 12, Yankee Clipper and Intrepid. And the idea with this one was, Apollo 11 was some way off its intended landing spot. Apollo 12, they wanted to get it spot on because they wanted to walk to where Surveyor 3, which was an unmanned probe from 1967, they wanted to walk to where that was. And they did that absolutely spot on perfectly. They took a colour TV camera and pointed it at the sun and destroyed it straight away, so that we still didn't get nice colour TV pictures. But the launch went well initially, and then, well, for the first 36 seconds, and then things got very interesting.
Trouble-free launch, and then all hell busted loose.
I just lost a whole bunch of stuff. I think we just had a whole bunch of buses drop out. What we got here, AC bus 1 light, all the fuel cells. Okay, Houston, we just lost the platform here, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload 1 and 2, main bus A and B out. We had some big glitch here, gang. I got AC. Got AC? Yes. Maybe it's just the indicator. What do you got on the main bus? 24 volts. That's low. We got a short on it of some kind, but I can't believe that's accurate.
Flight Ecom.
Go Ecom.
I think it's a fuel cell bus failure. They've been thrown offline somehow. That must be why we're getting garbage here. Can they try SCE to aux?
Jared Griffin had never heard that command before. I'm pretty sure most of the people in Mission Control hadn't. Tell him.
Apollo 12, Houston. Try SCE to auxiliary. Over.
FCE to auxiliary? What the hell is that?
CE.
I'm not sure even Pete knew what that was. But one person did.
I know what that is. SCE to aux.
We're getting good telemetry from you again. Try to reset your fuel cells.
Reset fuel cells. Wait for staging. Wait for staging, yes. Hang on. Okay, Houston, GDC is good. We got a good S2, gang.
We copy that, Pete. You're looking good.
So they are. That was the very eventful launch of Apollo 12, which was struck by lightning twice on the way up. Now, this is another one of those things, I think, where 1960s approaches to health and safety are different from what would happen now. I think if that had happened now, the mission would become to get them back straight down to Earth safely, and not to sort of say, well, you know, we've got through that, so let's just go to the moon. Different time and different values, I think. So that brings us. That brings us to Apollo 13. So I just had a slight stutter of the computer there. And Apollo 13, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes intended to land at Framora. Slight problem on launch that one of the engines shut down prematurely, but that was okay because they could burn the other 4 just longer. They still had the fuel to do that. And it had all become a bit routine. And then this happened.
And then if you could give your oxygen tanks a stir.
What did you do?
Nothing, I stirred the tanks.
Whoa.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem.
There you go, the famous misquote. He actually said, Houston, we've had a problem. Was the actual text, but this is the movies, so they changed things a little bit. If you've never seen Ron Howard's film, I can't believe that anyone here hasn't seen Apollo 13. It's been on television plenty of times, but it's absolute must-see film, and it's a pretty accurate record of what happened. Makes 1 or 2 mistakes, like trying to add up numbers with the slide rule, which you can't, but it's otherwise it's pretty good. So they were in this situation now where they weren't going to the moon because they decided here that when after 55 hours they had the explosion, then they took the decision not to perform direct abort, that is to say not to come straight home, but instead to go round the moon and come back. They then decided to use the lunar module engine, not the surface module one, because this was obviously damaged. That was a photo they took at a later stage of the damaged spacecraft. They did various things to. The famous one, of course, being that they had to adapt the CO2 scrubber from the lunar module from the command module to work in the lunar module. The lunar module was only intended to have 2 people in it for a short time, and the 2 different manufacturers had used square and round pipes to process this, and they had to do all that sort of duct tape and Blue Petery stuff and so on. But they did it, and they got Apollo 13 back. I'll not dwell on that because it's worthy of an entire talk of its own, but they got Apollo 13 home, and so it was defined as a successful failure in that they got the astronauts back, but they didn't lose anybody. Apollo 14, Alan Shepard finally gets onto an Apollo. He had been grounded for some years following his first flight in 1961, but he managed to become the commander of Apollo 14, landed in Framoro, and they had slightly redesigned the craft after things learnt from Apollo 13. They had an extra oxygen tank and some modifications to the wiring. They had a problem with the docking mechanism there, in that it took 6 attempts to actually get the lunar module docked to the command and service module. Now, that had to work again when they came back from the moon. And if it took 6 attempts to dock the first time, you'd kind of be a bit wary of that, wouldn't you? Because this time, coming up from the moon, it's got 2 astronauts inside, and you really want that to work. They actually did the first live patching of the computer there, and they had a radar failure on the way down. But actually, it was the most accurate landing of all the Apollos. Shepard played golf on the moon.
Houston, while you're looking that up, you might recognize what I have in my hand is the handle for the contingency sample return. It just so happens to have a genuine 6-iron on the bottom of it. In my left hand, I have a little white pellet that's familiar to millions of Americans. Drop it down. Unfortunately, the suit is so stiff I can't do this with 2 hands, but I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here. They got more dirt than ball left side. More dirt than ball. Here we go again. That looked like a slice to me, Al. There we go. There's the die. One more. Miles and miles and miles. Very good, Dan.
Apollo 15, 1971, July and August 1971, the command service module was Endeavour, the lunar module was Falcon. And what was different about Apollo 15, this is the first one where they took the lunar rover with it. So they'd actually expanded the sort of luggage space of the lunar module and fitted this 209 kilogram electric vehicle there. And this bothers me immensely because it's no secret that I'm 60 years old now, and people haven't been to the moon since 1972, and it's only fairly recently that Americans have got the ability to get men back into space at all since the retirement of the shuttle. And yet, when I was 9 at this point, and they were driving electric cars on the moon. How extraordinary does that feel? Great mission. They landed at Hadley Rill. They did 4 EVAs, 3 of which with the lunar rover. They'd actually made the spacesuits last longer. They had a couple of problems, and there was a thing with the postal covers controversy. I won't go into that, but a couple of the astronauts took stamps up and sold them expensively to a German stamp dealer and made a lot of money out of it. And they never flew again. So there was that controversy, and there was an experiment. Let's have a look.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our Falcon. And I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? Proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Well, so that was the Apollo 15 mission. Oops. And there's the lunar rover. Now, here's a curious thing about it, and we'll see how useful it is, that this had its own radio link to Earth. It did not need the lunar module to be there to transmit signals to the Earth. It had its own SHF dish that could be set up like that. And otherwise, you've got electrically driven rubber tyres and seating and equipment all there for various experiments to be done. So here's Apollo 16, Casper and Orion, and this was 16th to 27th of April 1972, delayed a little bit due to problems, but the mission was John Young, Charlie Duke and Ken Mattingly. John Young and Charlie Duke went down to the lunar surface. Ken Mattingly looked after the command module. And they did 16.6 miles of driving electric cars on the moon. I think that's absolutely amazing. Let's have a look at some of that driving.
Let me up to anything.
Deck's on, Mark. That max acceleration?
No.
Man, you are really bouncing.
Is he on the ground at all? That's 10 kilometers.
Huh? He's got about 2 wheels on the ground. He's a big rooster tail out of all 4 wheels. And as he turns, he skids. The back end breaks loose just like on snow. Come on back, John. Hey, the deck is running. Man, I'll tell you, Indy's never seen a driver like this. Okay, when he hits the craters and starts bouncing is when he gets his rooster tail. He makes sharp turns. Hey, that was a good stop. Those wheels just locked. Mark off.
Okay. Do you want to do it one more time?
Yeah.
Got about a minute and 5 seconds that
Okay,
time.
mark on. Okay, you could have gone the other way. Go ahead. There's the big craters there, though, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't want to run into those holes.
They want 4 minutes worth, John. Well, that was a minute and 5. Maybe you could do it twice more.
Charlie.
Okay, turn sharp.
I have no desire to turn sharp. Okay, here's a Sharpie.
Hey, that's great. Man, those things, when those wheels really dig in, John, when you turn is when you get the rooster tail. The suspension system on that thing is fantastic.
That sounds good. We sound like we've probably got enough of the Grand Prix. We're willing to let you go on from here. Call that a Grand Prix.
Okay. Man, that was all 4 wheels off the ground there. Okay, max stop.
Okay, I don't want to do that.
Okay, excuse me.
They say that's a no-no.
Isn't that just extraordinary? Joy riding on the moon. There we are. Okay, well, the final main Apollo mission was Apollo 17. Cernan, Evans and Schmidt, 7th and 19th of December 1972. And Harrison Schmitt, they finally got a scientist to go to the moon. He wasn't a test pilot whenever he was moved from the cancelled Apollo 18 because he was a geologist, and he's the only scientist to have been to the moon at all. And it was the only launch they did at night as well. And they did it was the longest EVA, 22 hours total on the mission. So that was Apollo 17, and that was the last of the Apollos. Here's the launch of the lunar module. Let's talk about this afterwards.
I'm going to get the pro. 99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Regs are good. Ag thought. Pitch over.
Roger, you have good thrust.
Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Okay, coming through 1,500 feet. And H-dot looks good.
The conspiracy theorists love that because what happens there, you see the cameraman zoom out and then he pans up perfectly with the lunar module, and you see the craft going to... Well, hang on a minute. there's only 2 people on the moon, and they're both in the lunar module. So how does that work then? Now then, I did mention earlier that the rover has its own SHF link to Earth, and what they did, they put a camera on that, pointed it at the lunar module, and actually that camera was remotely controlled from Earth. So someone in mission control did the zooming out and the panning upwards of the camera. And you may say, well, he did that remarkably accurately, considering the there's 2.5 seconds of radio delay both ways there. How did he work around that? And the answer is that this wasn't the first time he'd done this. This was the 3rd time he'd done this. And the first 2, Apollos 15 and 16, he didn't get it right, but Apollo 17, his last chance, he did get it right. So you're not seeing a studio there with a cameraman in it. The cameraman is in mission control. But it does fool a lot of conspiracy theorists, that one. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit more briefly about Apollo applications. Apollo applications, the idea was, having built Saturn V rockets and so on, what else can they do with it? And this is all the stuff they wanted to do. They wanted to build a lunar base between 1969 and 76. And they wanted to go exploring from the lunar base as well. They wanted to have an escape system so they could leave the lunar base if they needed to. The manned Venus flyby we'll look at, and Skylab was the actual only one of the Apollo applications that they in fact did. They took Apollo 20's Saturn V and reallocated it to Skylab. So let's have a quick look at this. Skylab, they launched Skylab, Saturn V, uncrewed, and it was the top part of the command service module was remodeled to become the whole of Skylab. That's one of the servicing missions, not the actual one, because that's a Saturn 1B. Then they had 3 Saturn 1B missions that took astronauts up for periods of time, each a bit longer than the one before. So there were a total of 4 Skylab missions, 3 manned, 1 unmanned. Plans for a 5th, but it never happened. They sort of ran out of money and interest at that point. Skylab wasn't really quite the great success they hoped it would be. But that's that. So bits of inside. It was quite a spacious space station, really. They had lots of room in it. These are all replicas at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, that I photographed. There you can actually have a sort of shower. No gravity, of course, so the water will go all over the place. So you do it with a damp towel, roughly. Waste management. That's really sort of a kitchen kind of thing. And it all looks quite comfortable, doesn't it? That's Skylab. The Apollo Venus flyby. Now this is just so ridiculous, it's amazing. But they planned, they never did it, but they planned a 1-year mission launching on the 5th of April 1972 from Earth here, right, and then flying towards Venus, passing Venus on August the 23rd, 1972, and then coming back and catching up with Earth again and going to Earth orbit on March the 30th, 1973. How would you do that and not go nuts? That's what I can't really get over. This was the craft they envisaged. It was the Saturn V launch, and then this part of the rocket here became where they actually lived in that time. So they just evacuated, after they burnt all the fuel in the rocket, they evacuated all the fuel from here, filled it up with oxygen, and lived in there for a year. Would have been an amazing mission if it ever happened, but it didn't. One that they did do, this is not Apollo 18 as some people sometimes call it, but this was the last Apollo, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. To take an Apollo and a Soyuz and dock them together in low Earth orbit. Having built the requisite sort of bit that goes in between, that interfaces the different docking systems of the 2 rockets. And they did that. It was absolutely superb. Three Apollo astronauts, Stafford, Brandon, Slayton. Dick Slayton was one of the Mercury 7, but he actually was grounded due to having atrial fibrillation. They sorted that out. Various drugs can control that, and he was cleared to fly in 1972, so they got him a flight on the last Apollo in 1975. And with Alexei Leonov and Kubasov, 2 Soviet cosmonauts, They docked over France in July 1975. Great stories came out of this. I'll just tell you one of them actually, that they spoke each other's languages. They had to so the Americans learned to speak Russian, the Russian cosmonauts learned to speak English, what they did, they trained obviously in each other's training centres as well, which meant that the 3 American astronauts had to go to Star City, Baikonur as it is now, in Siberia, and they spent long times there, and they got bored, and they did start to wonder things, because this was the Soviet Union, like if they were being bugged. So Tom Stafford came up with a great idea, and he said, we've got lots of downtime here, and it's a bit boring. Wouldn't it be great if we had something like a pool table to pass the time? And the following day, a pool table appeared. So that'll be a yes then. But the thing about Apollo-Soyuz is that it laid the ground for a lot of future work. Although it kind of went cold again because after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, relations weren't quite so good for a while. But then later on, the shuttle and the Mir space station, they docked, and they built on the technology that had come out of Apollo-Soyuz, and then of course the International Space Station, when they actually realised that the Americans couldn't afford to build what they wanted to call Space Station Freedom themselves, and they needed to collaborate with lots of others, including the Russians, and that was all made easier by the fact that they had done this collaborative project before. And we get a benefit from that actually here in Ireland. The only reason that the ISS is visible from Ireland is because in order to get Russian money, it had to be in an orbit where it was visible from Moscow. So that's how we get to see it here in Ireland. So that really is it. There's the 2 crews together and their docked spacecraft. And just one thing, Skylab could have been rescued by the shuttle if the shuttle was available soon enough, but the first shuttle launch was in 1981, and Skylab fell out of the sky in July 1979, crashed in Australia. You could buy, and there's a young lady modelling one here, a Skylab protective helmet with guaranteed money back if you got killed by bits of falling Skylab. But that really was the end. That was the last bit of Apollo. There was no Skylab 5 to rescue Skylab, and the shuttle wasn't there in time, so that was the end of that. And that really is pretty much the end of it. There he is. There's Kennedy and his achievement. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. Well, on the 24th of July 1969, NASA achieved all that and a load more we've seen. I'm just going to go back to one last thing. This is my Columbo. I'm a Columbo fan. This is one more thing. We'll go back to Christmas Eve, 1968, which is where I came in. And this is a little bit of a reconstruction of Orbit 4 of 10 of Apollo 8.
Hey, don't take that. It's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick.
Oh, man, that's great. Where is it?
Quick.
It's out here.
Just grab me a color. A color exterior.
Hurry up.
Got one?
Yeah, I'm looking for one. C368.
Anything, quick.
Here.
What? We missed it.
Hey, I got it right here.
Let me get up this a lot clearer.
Bill, I got a phrase that's very clear right here. You got it?
Yep. Take several of them.
Take several of them. Here, give it to me.
Wait a minute, let me just get the right setting here. Now, just calm down, Momo.
Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot. 250 at F11. No, there's the explosion.
I did.
I picked you up there. You sure you got it now?
Yeah, it'll come up again, I think.
So there you go. And this is the lasting legacy of Apollo for me, is that photograph of the Earth. And what the photographer, Bill Anders, was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 8, and he didn't really have very much to do because Apollo 8 had no lunar module. So he was taking pictures out the window, and he got this one. And what he said about it was, we came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth. And so I will leave you with that picture that kick-started the whole ecology movement and gave us an entirely different appreciation of our own home. So I'm sorry I've gone over time a bit, but thank you very much. I hope that has been useful and entertaining for you.